Welcome everybody to a quick video talking about the recent JSCM editorial addressing confusion in the diffusion of archival data research by Beth Davis-Schrammick, Brian Fugate, Mark Pagel, Barb Flynn. And as you can probably guess by that beautiful Broad College business background and Michigan State University under my name, Jason Miller. So, kind of the background of this editorial is through a lot of conversations and then a lot of experiences of all of us working with archival data, we got talking about issues that we saw and we'd experienced through our own review processes and that we saw as, editors-in-chief, as associate editors and reviewers. And as the supply chain discipline starts to, broaden our use with and experience with archival data, just wanted to, kind of have some, talking points, or I'd say even more broadly, a discussion of things. We have never mean this editorial to be the statement on these matters, but just a talking point for further consideration. And so with that, there were sort of some key themes that emerged as we talked amongst ourselves on these issues. And one of those dealt with sampling, frame, and research design. And a couple of sort of the key things that we, take away from this video, and please just read the article for more depth about these different topics, but is recognizing that archival data is often from non-random samples, so may be targeted at larger firms. If you're using data from CompuStat, you're obviously using publicly traded firm data. Publicly traded firms are much larger than industry peers, or you may be limited to firms that will share data with you. The key thing we want to emphasize is be transparent about these issues. When we talk, and the reason for that is that's going to affect how we can generalize our results and what confidence we can have in generalizing results. When it comes to data handling, archival data is going to have cases that have measurement errors, coding errors, observations that make no sense. If you remove those, please just be transparent about it. So one thing I can say from my experience is I always keep a file with every data set I work with, noting unusual cases, and if I remove those, I will take note of that. That way it can be reported. Always keep track of these things. Another theme we wanted to touch on is oftentimes with archival data, it can take a long time for it to be cleaned and released. That means the data may have the appearance of being old. We're not worried about that so much as long as you, the authors, can make a strong case that the underlying mechanisms that you're theorizing should operate to bring about relationships are stable over time. So with sample frame and research design, the key word is transparency on several different issues. Now, talking about the data itself, one of the key things that we're focusing on is we're using this data for some theoretical purpose, which means that we're taking measures that were collected by others, and we are going to be claiming that these represent certain constructs. And this brings about the discussion about validity. And the one thing we wanted to encourage in this editorial is a move away from sort of this checklist mentality of validity that I think all of us on this author team would admit that we have fallen prey to ourselves, where you view validity as a checklist and you go on from there, to replacing it with an idea from education, especially in psychology, where validity is viewed as a unitary concept, where what it boils down to is, can I assign a given interpretation to a measure, and can I use this measure for a specific purpose? No, there's 5 facets of validity, some of which are going to be familiar, like content evidence, internal structure, and how does a measure relate to other measures for which it should be theoretically connected to. The 2 that I want to bring up here are, first off, be very clear about the response process that is utilized to generate the archival data you're working with. So one key thing we wanted to bring up is archival data often takes the form of a survey. So this starts life as surveys that are conducted, for example, by the Census Bureau as part of the monthly retail trade survey, and are then processed into industry level aggregates. We raise this point because we feel that a stark contrast between archival data and primary survey data is not warranted in many instances. And the key thing to think about here is, what is that process that is utilized to generate the data? Is there, for example, some type of audit that takes place? With data from, let's say, the Census Bureau, there are civil penalties if you lie on one of these surveys. And so that would give you more of a feeling of confidence about how these data are created. The second aspect concerns the consequences for how you're using archival data. So typically for our research in SCM, we don't think too much about consequences of measurement use, but in fields like education, where we're dealing with creating high-stakes standardized tests, there can be severe consequences for how a measure is used. It can affect college admission decisions. So the one thing we want to stress is, if you are, for example, generating your own measures and you're going to be releasing those, recognize that it may be appropriate to use a measure for one purpose, but not another purpose. A topic that often comes up as well with validity with archival data concerns the fact you often have single item measures. You can still go through this validity assessment for a single item measure. The key thing is you don't have any discussion of internal structure, because there's nothing that this measure should be correlated with. So just keep in mind, single item measures are not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes it's what you're limited to, but you should still go through this process. And lastly, that brings us to the discussion of endogeneity, and specifically endogeneity due to omitted variable bias. So a few points that we wanted to stress with this editorial are: one, some research questions render endogeneity a moot point. If somebody would have data from 150 retailers and they'd be curious in modeling how stable the correlation is across these firms' inventory turnover ratios over time, it's not a question of omitted variable bias. That's something that can be answered very easily with a covariance pattern model. And so that's the type of research question for which endogeneity isn't a concern. Now, anytime we're arguing some construct represented by measure or measures X affects another construct, which we'll call Y, then we have the issue of endogeneity raising its head. Most important thing, include relevant control variables to the extent possible. Now, relevant control is some variable that is theoretically upstream of our focal predictor, and this is important, whose inclusion does not render the conditional or the partial relationship between X and Y meaningless. So this is going to shock everyone. I'm going to use a trucking example here. Imagine I want to study whether larger, less than truckload carriers are more efficient than smaller, less than truckload carriers. So my Y in this case is technical efficiency, which I obtained from a data and development analysis. My X is size. And say I measure size based on the number of power units. Now, should I include as a control variable, call it variable Z, the value of fixed assets? The answer is no. Because if I include Z, what I'm now saying is holding fixed assets constant, what is the effect of changing the number of power units on efficiency? That is no longer representing size. That measure of power units no longer means size. It now has some sort of convoluted meaning dealing with sort of the number of trucks that I have per total amount of fixed assets. It has a really weird interpretation. So what that means is I would not want to include that control variable, because it makes that relationship very unclear. Carlson and Wu in a 2012 org research methods paper say it very well. Adding more control variables does not make a study more rigorous, and when in doubt, leave them out. So every control variable should have a stated purpose for why it is in there. One thing to remember, for an omitted variable, call it U, to change the relationship between X and Y, two conditions have to be met. First, U must be partially correlated with X, holding constant all your control variables. Second, U must be partially correlated with Y, holding constant X and all the control variables. That is a much more stringent criteria for U to meet, so U being that omitted variable, than what we commonly think of and what commonly gets seen in referee reports when the statement is, well, this omitted variable is correlated with X, therefore you have endogeneity. Just the fact that the omitted variable is correlated with X does not mean there's endogeneity. Those more stringent conditions have to hold. And lastly, we want to emphasize that while instrumental variable estimation, if it can be successfully carried out, can certainly increase confidence in results, you may not always be able to use instrumental variable estimation. You may have some interaction terms, which makes IV estimation difficult to conceptualize. You may have a situation where you don't have good instruments. And if you cannot find good instruments, you are much better off just including those relevant controls and noting this as a limitation. My conceptual takeaway with instrumental variable estimation is the following example. Imagine I got my predictor X. If I remove all the variance associated with my control variables, 80% of X remains. I find two instruments for X, and they're significant, they pass all the tests, but they only explain 2% of X's variation over and above my controls. What do you have more confidence with? The regression model, where I essentially have 80% of X's variance entering in, versus the IV model, where I only have 2% of that variation. Me personally, I feel better with 80% than 2%. So always keep that in mind as you're thinking of instrumental variable estimation. While it can certainly strengthen our confidence in results, it is not a cure-all for everything. And so with that, I hope this video has been interesting, and everyone take care, stay safe, and please, please, please wear a mask.